document per se, could be author, the title of the file, creation date, last modified date, and email. One of the most notoriously known ESI in terms of eDiscovery is date sent, date received, subjects, recipients. But luckily, next class, Ray, will take a deeper dive into metadata. So be sure to tune in on that class.
I like that. You make a pitch for the next class. I like that. That's awesome.
Absolutely.
Thank you, sir.
Sorry, I wish I could have a little bit bigger cliffhanger, but you know. But in terms of eDiscovery, right? So there's two types of ESI: the custodial data and non-custodial data sources. By definition, custodial data is the data sources that are directly controlled or managed by a specific individual, such as a user's mailbox and their associated attachments, you know, the data on a user's hard drive. Also, a user's account storage in the cloud, such as OneDrive or Box. Those are all what you would classify as custodial data. And the other type would be the non-custodial data sources. These are data sources that are not associated or possessed by an individual, and they're typically in those systems or databases. As you can see, there's some examples: SharePoint sites, shared directories, maybe on a network drive or application. So ESI, it's really the cornerstone of eDiscovery because it reflects how the information is created and maintained in this digital age we have right now. And without the ESI, there would be no eDiscovery process to undertake. So as we get a little closer to what is eDiscovery, right? First, let's cover discovery, right? So discovery is the formal legal process of exchanging information between parties about evidence that they will present in trial. The purpose for discovery is to allow both parties in the lawsuit to gather and exchange their relevant information and evidence before a trial. The idea here is to create a level playing field and to promote a fair outcome. In addition, it could also encourage settlements by making clear what evidence each party has. So with the exponential growth of ESI over the past couple decades and the digital conversions of physical materials into digital formats, the term discovery has kind of morphed into eDiscovery. That said, the same definition still applies. You know, so eDiscovery specifically refers to the ESI in the process in which it is identified, preserved, collected, and searched with the intent of using it as evidence. I previously mentioned about the digital age, and you know, with that comes a vast amount of rise into digital technology and the exponential growth of this ESI. So our ability to sift through the vast amounts of electronic data is essential for building a strong legal case. In 2005, a framework was created to establish a standard approach to eDiscovery, making sure that ESI is handled properly and with precision. This framework is known as the Electronic Discovery Reference Model, or for short, the EDRM. Ray, you want to bounce to the next slide?
There we go.
Thank you. Yep. So again, this is the Electronic Discovery Reference Model, known as the EDRM. It contains 9 different stages, and I'll briefly cover these at a high level so that we can later discuss some records management intersection with eDiscovery, but I won't go too deep. So from left to right, the information governance, that's our strategic approaches to managing your information with policies, processes, and controls. Basically, bringing your order of information, bring in an order of your information chaos. Identification, you know, locating potential sources of ESI and determining its scope. Preservation is to ensure that the ESI is protected against the inappropriate modification or destruction. Then we jump into collection. That's kind of self-description there, where we're gathering the data, and then move on to processing, where the data volume is reduced by calling out non-relevant data and preparing it for review. And review is when the information is, you know, being looked over for relevance and privilege. And then analysis, evaluating the ESI for the content and context to support legals or compliance's eDiscovery strategy. Production, delivery of the final data set of the ESI to the opposing party. One of the key points here is making it easily understandable and defensible in court. And last, the presentation. This is where the legal teams display the ESI in a courtroom or other legal proceedings serving as evidence. One thing to note on this model, you'll see kind of in the background in the color on the left-hand side is the yellow and the green in the middle and the blue on the right-hand side. As you move through the EDRM workflow, the amount of data significantly decreases as the non-relevant information is called out, right? So what that results in is a smaller data set, but a significantly higher ratio of relevant information. And another important note about the EDRM coming from the founders themselves is that this model represents a conceptual view of the eDiscovery process, not necessarily a linear model. So what that means is you can be engaged in different aspects of this model at the same time or carry out some different steps in a different order if necessary. A very quick high-level example of that could be during the exercise of an early case assessment. Early case assessment involves gathering and analyzing the information early in the early case with the goal to estimate your risk, develop a case strategy, and your cost. And during this ECA process, there could be one or two primary custodians whose emails have been collected and are being reviewed by legal, and with the purpose to see if other custodians are subjects to this litigation, right? So maybe additional custodians need to be added to the litigation, the custodian list. Then you have to go back and preserve their data, collect their data, right? So it's like I said, it's more of a it's a non-linear, it's a conceptual view, right? So understanding this EDRM can help your organization increase its eDiscovery processes and streamline them while minimizing the risks and most importantly, helping to ensure your compliance and your legal obligations.
All right, thanks, Cody, for that great overview of eDiscovery and the EDRM and ESI and all that good stuff. So I will be talking about the information governance / records management side of things. So first off, I want to talk about the difference between information governance versus records management, because sometimes they are used interchangeably, but they do have distinct differences. So just very high level, information governance is, I like to think of it as an umbrella that records management falls under. And another way I look at that is like IT has various different, departments and teams under it, such as security, networking, eDiscovery sometimes even falls under IT or sometimes legal, depending on where you are. And so records management kind of follows that as well. And information governance is more the overall strategy and framework for managing all information across the organization. And that includes things like policies, procedures, roles, security, and best practices, to name a few. Whereas records management is more responsible for managing a record throughout its entire life cycle, from beginning to end. So, in other words, from creation all the way to its final disposition. And records management also includes, defining what a record is, the various record types, where they should be stored, and how they should be stored, how they should be preserved or maintained, and then ultimately how they should be disposed of or destroyed. And all of these things are typically for a legal, regulatory, or business requirement. So certain documents or records are legally required to be retained for X number of years. And same thing for regulatory purposes. But some records may not have a legal or regulatory purpose, but they are needed for the business and in order to conduct business. And so as a part of that, some general key questions to ask are, does the record have administrative purpose? Does it have fiscal or financial purposes? Does it have historical, legal, research, or informational purposes? And that can help determine or classify what should be considered a record. And it's also important to note that there are documents that don't fall under any of those, and those are just simply called non-records. And a typical example of a non-record would be duplicates or copies of an original or an official record. So for example, if you were to copy a document or print it out for reference purposes, that is not a record, and that should be destroyed pretty much as soon as it's no longer needed, because it's not the official record, which is already being maintained and preserved elsewhere. And just a couple of other examples of what non-records could be are things like certain drafts, templates, or publicly available information, which can include things like journals, newspapers, or publications, things of that nature. And on the next slide, thank you, Ray. Now that we have a high level understanding of eDiscovery and the eDRM, as well as records management, now let's kind of talk about how they intersect with each other and how they affect and influence each other, because they are actually very closely tied together. So I first want to talk about what's on the left-hand side here, which is the information governance reference model. And this just kind of shows how managing information affects the entire organization and all of its departments, and how they're all sort of connected to each other through data and information. And that just shows that, managing information, it affects the entire organization. So having a strong information governance framework directly impacts eDiscovery by improving things like data accessibility, reduces time during some of the phases in the eDRM, as well as reduce costs, and also by mitigating risks. And we are going to touch on all of those things in the middle portion of this graphic. So first up is the records index. And a records index is simply a tool that allows users to find information more quickly and efficiently by providing what information is available, where it is, and ideally, but not always possible, date ranges of that information. And so the records index plays a very important role in both the identification and collection phases of the eDRM. So the identification phase is primarily about finding relevant information for the eDiscovery request, as well as relevant data sources. And that's exactly what a records index provides. It provides where information is stored, and it also helps you find what information may be relevant. For example, it can help you find financial records, HR records, manufacturing records, clinical records, whatever the legal request may be. If you have a robust records index, that will help you find where those records are. And then why I mentioned having a date range included in the index would also be incredibly helpful, but again, not always possible, is because oftentimes, or sometimes, eDiscovery requests come with a date range. And that could potentially exclude certain data sources right from the start if you know when data was stored in a particular location and at what time. But knowing where that information is, as well as when it was available, is also very important during the collection phase so that you know where to apply date ranges to certain locations when you're going out to collect those softwares or applications or systems. So sort of a real life example of this is, let's say you have an eDiscovery request to collect financial records from 2020 to the present. And by going out to the records index, you see that all financial records have been kept in your financial software, whether it's Oracle Financials, SAP, Momentum if you're the government, or whatever financial application it is. So you know exactly where to go to collect financial records for the last 5 or so years. However, let's change that scenario a little bit and say that back in 2021, there was a migration from one system to another. So you stopped using one financial software and then you started using a different one back in 2021. So now you have records in one system going all the way back to 2021. And then from 2021, even further back, it's stored in another system. So what that means is now you have 2 different sources that you have to collect data from. Now, there are some nuances there, such as was the data migrated when you moved from one system to the other? Because in that case, you may not need to collect from 2 different sources because that data was moved to the new system. But if it wasn't, then you do have to collect from multiple sources. And you have to be aware of the date ranges of that information of each system. And data not being migrated can happen and happens quite often, especially with mergers or acquisitions. So you typically bring in all of those systems and applications from the acquired company. And sometimes data migration may not even be possible just because the systems are not compatible with each other. The fields don't match up. Whatever the reason is, you can't just pick up the data from the old system and move it into the new one. And so whatever data was on those old systems stay there. And so you have to go to that system to collect it if it falls within the date range of the eDiscovery request. And again, I just want to stress that is why it is so important to note that the records index comes into play heavily with the identification and collection phase when it comes to identifying all of these types of information, so that you know all of the potentially relevant data sources to collect from. And then for the next 3 bubbles I have here, the retention schedule, the records policy, and the data disposition, I'm going to sort of clump all of these together because they are very closely related. But very briefly, retention schedule is, in a nutshell, is what categorizes records into groups and also specifies their retention periods, or in other words, how long those records should be maintained. The records policy, this outlines the processes or procedures for managing records. So where and how records are created, stored, and destroyed, or sometimes archived. And then data disposition is the systematic process of destroying or archiving data that has come to the end of its life cycle, as described in the retention schedule. But doing so doing so in a way that is both secure and compliant with any rules or regulations, for example, including a certificate of destruction when data is disposed. And so with these three things, by following the retention schedule as well as your data disposition procedures, that can reduce the overall amount of data that is discoverable through regular and scheduled disposition of records through good faith. And by doing so, by reducing that amount of discoverable data, it reduces legal risk, because if that data was not destroyed according to the retention schedule, that means that you still have those records. And if they are relevant to the case, you are liable for collecting and possibly producing that data, which could also potentially open up the organization to some legal risk. So ensuring that you follow the retention schedule as well as the documented data disposition process will help mitigate that risk. And also during the collection phase, it also just helps reduce time in the collection phase, because just through the process of culling through and searching data sources, the more information you have, obviously, the longer that process will take. So by staying on top of the retention schedule, you can shorten the collection process and time as well. And then for the records policy, again, that ensures that records are being stored and maintained properly and in their proper locations. And then also ensuring that the proper processes for disposition are followed. And this piece sort of ties into the preservation phase of the EDRM by ensuring data is properly stored, maintained, and protected, which is what the preservation phase is kind of all about. And all of these things, the retention, the policy, the data disposition, and records index, all of these things goes towards this principle of having repeatable and defensible processes, which you may hear quite often in the eDiscovery space. And so I am going to kick it back off to Cody to talk about these last 3 points that we have here.
Thanks, Vince. Okay, so another key component of the information governance wheel is the data classification, right? Because it involves categorizing the data based on sensitivity, intended use, or potential risk to make sure that proper handling and the files are secure as needed. So a way this could help the preservation and collection phase is from an e-discovery and compliance standpoint, if the data is classified properly, it can lead to more efficient and e-discovery workflows, including review that you don't see here. So first, it can enable targeted collection, right? So by using the classification, you can target only the relevant information, which later then reduces the amount of volume that you're collecting and processing and reviewing. And that kind of bleeds into the second improvement time of your review, right? So if you have the proper classification in place, it can help you quickly determine and identify documents that may need to be or should be redacted or excluded from production later on in the e-discovery workflow. Without that proper classification, the review teams would have to find them during their manual review process. And guess what? That will increase the review time, higher costs, also increase the risks of producing something that you might or shouldn't. Data mapping, it's not the same, but kind of high level same as a records index, but from an e-discovery, more of a standpoint. So a company cannot preserve, collect, review, produce any of the information that it's unaware it has. So knowing what data exists, where it's at, and who manages it is a key first step to litigation readiness, right? So this is where the data mapping can come in to support that. They're very comprehensive. They include an inventory of potential discoverable data. And generally, they include what types and formats of data, where the data is located, is there predecessors or successors to the data, who owns the data, and maybe when it should be archived or deleted, right? But it's important that you maintain your focus on these the data maps, because they should be considered a living, breathing document that's monitored and maintained over time, because data sources change, data stores retire or switch positions, and new data streams or storages are added on an ongoing basis. And last, the data preservation, right? So when an organization is reasonably anticipates a litigation, they're required to preserve ESI that may be relevant, right? So from a records management standpoint, that means suspending any of your routine data deletion or records management protocols to make sure that any potential relevant ESI isn't destroyed or altered. And records management managers can support and facilitate proper changes for this to prevent these accidental deletions or of relevant information, help to maintain proper chains of custodies, and also collaborating with IT or legal to retrieve archived data that has been identified as a potential data that needs to be placed on legal hold. All right, so proactively identifying and preserving the relevant data, they can minimize the risks of legal penalties that's associated with spoliation, right? Missing or altered our data. So by organize, I mean, the key takeaway here from Vince and I's slide here, but organizing data systematically, I guess, reducing the amount of irrelevant information, preserving the essential data along with its metadata, right? Because the metadata can be a big key, and adhering to compliance standards. Records management can make the eDiscovery process a lot more efficient, cost-effective, and legally sound, right? These improvements transform what could be a cumbersome process into one that's not only manageable, but also repeatable and defensible.
Cool. All right, gentlemen, are we ready to move on to Q&A?
I think so.
Yes, sir.
All right. Rich, I know you sent me a message that says we have nothing in the chat box. If any attendees have questions, by all means, type any question you have in the chat box, and we'll introduce it into this conversation. I do have some questions for our guests today. So again, if you have questions, please type them in the chat box, but we'll move on to question one. And either of you or both of you can give your response. Is eDiscovery a part of records management, or are they mutually separate?
Vince, unless you want to jump in, I can jump in.
Nope, you got it.
Yeah, I mean, they both have their unique objectives and strategy, but generally they're related and they overlap each other, right? So in the last slide, Vince and I were talking to, you could see all the aspects of the information governance that play an important role in streamlining and reducing risks across the eDiscovery workflow. So in tandem, when you're focusing on both of them together, you can really drive your litigation support activities to become more efficient, focusing on reducing your risks, right? Collecting privileged documents, right? As soon as you collect those, you're putting the organization at risk, and you need to make sure, you know, they're redacted or excluded from the production, as well as costs, right? You don't want to pay a managed review or anyone reviewing documents when they don't need to. So you want to be able to eliminate as much as what we could all say would be maybe low-hanging fruit from the get-go, right? So yeah, they're separate, but they're very, very related, and they overlap.
Cool. All right. Question number 2. Is there anything records management can do that makes eDiscovery more efficient?
Yeah, so I can take that one. And
Absolutely.
yeah, so absolutely, first off.
Absolutely.
And we kind of touched a little bit on that, but just to sort of, you know, drive the point home that there are absolutely certain parts of records management, such as you know, identifying where the information is, having a strong and robust process for storing data, maintaining it, making sure that the locations are all, you know, standard and defined of where things should be stored, certain types of documents, as well as having a very well documented and defined process for disposition. All of these things can certainly make eDiscovery more efficient. Um, Again, just identifying, being able to identify where information is such a huge part of eDiscovery, because you don't know what you don't know, right? So if there's information that could be relevant, but you don't know that it exists, that could be a huge factor and potentially risk in the eDiscovery process, because there is information out there, you just don't know that it is there. So by having a strong records management, you can know that, you know, there could be relevant information out there. And then also just following regular disposition, again, lowers the total amount of volume of data that's discoverable, which, you know, speeds up processes, especially during the collection and review phases of the EDRM.
Cool. All right. Question number 3. How does a records manager play a critical role in eDiscovery? Cody, what do you think about that?
Yeah, so we did talk a lot about some of the topics that I'm not going to repeat, but I think one thing that would be worth bringing up is the new technology, right? New technology is advancing at rapid pace. Records managers they must be ready to respond to this new technology and overcome any of the new challenges that they might face in terms of records management policies and procedures for eDiscovery. So considering new technology, I'd suggest review your current requirements, your eDiscovery and legal compliance requirements in regards to records management, and confirm if these new technologies are meeting these requirements, or if there's updates needed, or if there's gap there, and then, you know, assess any gaps that you may need to cover. And then, you know, I guess, you know, define and set up workflows across any of the new technologies that is being implemented to address the future need for eDiscovery.
And let me pose a question 3A. Would you agree with me that it is really something a records manager has to consider, that they should play a critical role in eDiscovery because they're managing the records that need to be discovered to reply to, in essence, maybe litigation or some other response?
Yeah, absolutely. And most of the time, and to that point, when legal holds are issued, the majority of the clients that we've worked with, all the record managers, they are included in those legal hold responses for all those applications or data sources that must be placed on legal hold. So they're heavily involved in that eDiscovery workflow, maybe not so much specific or highly detailed aspects of it, but they're definitely informed stakeholder.
Okay. All right, let's deviate from my questions because we have a couple questions from our audience. The first question is from Jenna. What are the best practices for handling situations where eDiscovery information is stored in an outdated or inaccessible format? Which one of you would like that?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and I think that goes back into sort of managing those sources, right? And making sure that if it's, if it's stored on a server, making sure that that server is up to date on its security patches, and all of that IT security space, because you don't want to open that stuff up to risk. And in terms of having information in, different softwares or different systems that are about to be outdated or perhaps no longer supported by whatever vendor. It's important to stay on top of those, knowing when things are going to be discontinued, so that you can come up with a plan on how to move that data ahead of time.
All right, and let me ask my own sub question. We'll call it Jenna Part B, even though I'm
Hmm.
asking the question. Would it be a an accurate assessment that this is probably a key area where a records management professional or a records manager or senior person of records works with their IT counterpart to make sure that what Jenna asked in her question is addressed ahead of time?
Yes, absolutely. Having that collaboration between the two is vital,
Right,
honestly.
right.
Um, and that goes a lot into that question of, knowing when a system is about to become outdated, and working with the either the eDiscovery manager, the IT manager, or both of those actually, working together with them to, again, come up with a plan on how to make sure that the information does not become outdated or
Right.
potentially inaccessible.
Right, right. I mean, in years past, there was always people always said that records people didn't like IT people and IT people didn't
Hmm.
like records people. And I just think that, it was just making sure that, we respected each other and understood we didn't want to do the other person's job. Records managers
Hmm.
just wanted records management performed in the way, and IT people wanted to use their expertise to make sure that allowed us to happen. So I think the teamwork aspect there works really well. And then we have a question from Daphne. She says, shouldn't the legal side develop parameters for eDiscovery as the primary owner of their process?
Yeah, typically the eDiscovery process is owned by the legal department, at least in my experience. But however, it's, to develop that and maintain it there's always a close relationship with IT and records management, on a weekly basis, especially in very large organizations, as new data is being spun up, new applications are replacing old applications, some applications are being archived, right? There's, depending on how large of an organization, this could be dozens per week or even more. So legal legal drives that workflow, but it's set up in such a way that the records management and information technology, those departments as well, are highly collaborative in the approach to help support the legal objectives.
Right, right. And I think even in today's world, unlike when I first got involved, which was a lot of physical records, um, IT may not have been considered an integral component of the process because we're talking about physical
Mhm.
paper records. But once we've gone into advancing so far as we have in the electronic side of the house, it's just an automatic. There has to be a partnership of all three areas.
Yeah,
Cool.
absolutely. And with the new technologies, not just the data itself, but there's new technology that's being brought into organization at a rapid pace, more so than it ever has before. So there needs to be some sort of way to understand this new data that's being introduced to into the environment. Maybe 15, 20 years ago, the adoption rate was much lower, and you kind of had a better understanding. But now, at a global organization, you could have dozens of applications a month or even more being introduced into the environment. And you really need to have a good workflow and a process that multiple teams like legal, IT, and records management have insight into some of this data and the new data coming in or replacing existing systems. And so set up like a workflow to assess if this new data, even if it's replacing something that's already existing, has any kind of compliance or legal impact or eDiscovery impact to your organization. So if you kind of set those up early as part of the, bring organization to your information chaos, if you create a workflow from the very beginning, it allows you to stay on top of it.
Cool.
Yep.
All right.
Sorry, I just wanted to add one more point to that.
Sure.
I think Daphne brought up a really good point with that, in that it's not just the e-discovery sort of process and workflow, which is very important, but I think that oftentimes legal will also develop the parameters for the request itself, right? So
Mm-hmm.
oftentimes they'll say who the custodians of the request are, what data sources need to be collected, as well as the date range. And that's where I think that it is, again, owned by legal, but I think that is where records management really comes into play and can really help the legal department. And by sort of arming the legal department with the information that they need during that initial discovery phase of a lawsuit, by understanding where the information is and the date ranges, that can help them sort of negotiate those kinds of things.
Awesome. All right. Question number 4. How can employees be educated on proper records management practices and their e-discovery responsibilities?
Yeah, I'll jump in. Training, definitely important, right? Employees must know about the data retention and the deletion policies, right? So let's educate the employees on the legal hold process so they understand their roles and responsibilities and how it affects, and eDiscovery is dependent upon uh, the workflow of the preservation and retention policies, right? So a comprehensive overview could be helpful, describing how their policies and procedures ensure that content that would be needed for an e-discovery request or a compliance request could be quickly identified, retrieved, or even protected to be used in the future.
Yep, I absolutely agree with that. And I was going to say by attending webinars and classes such as these, but
Good
training,
answer.
but training is absolutely crucial.
It is. It's the key. I mean, if you have employees that aren't trained, they're going to do what they think is right, which may or not be correct. So training is definitely a way you want to go. All right. Question number 5. What kinds of information and records are subject to e-discovery?
Yeah, so that's pretty much any and
Everything.
all
Yeah.
electronic data.
Yeah. Everything is without question, for sure.
But again, so I think the key point there is what kinds of information and records. So again, things like non-records would not be subject to it. And again, that also comes down to the parameters set by the legal request.
Right.
But just from a general standpoint, pretty much any electronic data can be open or subject to eDiscovery.
Yeah. And as you said in a previous answer to a question, Vince, if you've got it, you have to disclose it.
Right, exactly.
Mhm.
Yep, yep. All right, and the last question for now, and I am kind of biased on one in particular, but I'll let you guys go first. What are some let me switch the question. What are some eDiscovery challenges that could be related to records management?
Again, I think the growth, the exponential growth of data, it's definitely making eDiscovery a little bit more challenging. But the records management policies and procedures are definitely helpful and will streamline the process, right? So Vince mentioned retention policies, data destructions. I mentioned data classifications. So all those strategic approaches to managing the information will help streamline any way to minimize the amount of data that makes its way through the eDiscovery process. Anything you can cut out from the very beginning is a huge help and removes a lot of the burden and costs and risks associated with the eDiscovery workflow. And I think the strong records management policies and procedures can definitely cut all that down.
Right. Right.
And
Vince?
another challenge and a big one that I have faced in the past is essentially fact finding. So there was this huge project of trying to discover what information there were on these sort of not random servers, but servers that nobody really knew anything about, that could potentially have been related. And so, the project was going out there and trying to find exactly what information was contained on these servers. And it could be anything. It could be servers, hard drives, a locker of laptops and cell phones, things that were not documented essentially. And that poses like a huge challenge because not only is that very time and cost consuming, but it could be very risky in a legal sense, because you also have generally tight deadlines with these requests, and so you don't always have time to go through all this and sift through all this vast amount of data. And so again, as Cody mentioned, having a strong records management program with policies and procedures in place, being able to identify all these things, that would greatly help on the eDiscovery side.
Cool. Well, gentlemen, we have come to the top of the hour. I'll give you each 30 seconds. Is there any last word of advice or any final words about our topic today you'd like to share with the attendees? Vince, why don't you go first?
Um, Not really. I just wanted to thank everybody who attended. Thank you for your time and listening to, Ray, Cody, and myself. And of course, if you have any other questions that come up after, you can always reach out to us and we'll be more than happy to address those. But again, thank you guys for attending, and look forward to the next time.
Cool. Cody?
Great. Thanks, Vince. Thanks, Ray, for having us. Also, March 24th, next class. Ray, you're going to dive deeper into that metadata. I can't wait to hear about it.
Metadata. That's where it's at. That also helps eDiscovery. All right, congratulations. We've completed class 2. We've talked about the eDiscovery and records management. We've talked about the eDiscovery process, technology and tools, eDiscovery challenges, as well as its benefits. Thank you for asking the questions that you have. As Cody indicated, our next class is about metadata, the what, when, and where of records management. What is metadata, the types of metadata, and everything else you see on the screen. So March 24th at 2 p.m., please feel free to tune in. Before we leave our class today, our records management extreme championship performance tip: never be afraid to ask for help from other records management professionals. I have been in a lot of different professions and industries over my time. I have never found a more giving, profession in records management. Everybody's willing to help everybody. You know, I'm not an expert on everything, and I don't think any of us are experts on anything or on everything. And so when you're not, find the person it is. And today's a prime example. Could I talk about eDiscovery? Sure, I can, but not to the level and the intricate points that I think Vince and Cody were able to do. So if you find yourself in that position and you're not the expert, never be afraid to look outside of your circle, or they may be a part of your existing circle, or maybe slightly beyond it. Invite them in, ask them the questions, and I think you'll be really happy with the interaction that you'll get. Again, join us for our next class on raising the records management bar. That'll be March 24th about metadata. Again, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Cody. Thank you, Vince. And thank everybody for tuning in. And we will talk to you in 2 weeks. Take care, everybody.